Welcome to the Open Loop podcast. It's a podcast exploring the people, companies, and ideas shaping the future of neurotechnology. I'm Chay, the founder of Carter Sciences, Recce Neuro, and the Neurotech newsletter. In each episode, I sit down with founders, operators, researchers, investors, and leaders building the edge of neuroscience, neurotechnology, and healthcare. We'll have honest conversations about people's journeys into the neurotech industry, what they're currently building, how it's going, the realities, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and what the future holds for the neurotech industry in general. Welcome to the next edition of the Open Loop podcast. I'm joined today by Corey Keller. I typically like to jump into these things with a brief introduction about the guest, but Corey's involved in quite a few different things. We can get into your background shortly, but so assistant professor over at Stanford, co-founder at Alto. I've pretty lost track trying to count how many sort of advisory positions you've had over the years in the neurotech space. You're involved in all corners of the market, from academia through to sort of founding businesses. And so I'll let you introduce yourself, Corey, and give a little rundown of who you are and what it is you're involved in.
Awesome. Thank you, Jay. It's a pleasure to be here. Okay, how far back do we go? Worth mentioning, my parents are in the mental health space, and my dad's a psychiatrist, private practice psychiatrist. My mom's a psychologist. So I think that was embedded deep early on, although I very much rejected that and really wanted nothing to do with medicine growing up. I was interested in math and engineering. And so I started in the liberal arts program, but ended up transferring into engineering pretty quickly and was very much drawn to it. Still kept the medical school space in the back of my mind and did the pre-med. And when it came at the end of college, I applied to 30 jobs. I wanted a job that gave me some research experience and hospital experience working with patients, and got one. I happened to be in an epilepsy unit doing intracranial microelectrode recordings in patients with epilepsy. I knew nothing about epilepsy, nothing about neuroscience. I was sort of an electrical engineer that would help with cabling and recording, but it threw me into this amazing world of neuroscience. And so that's from there, I just sort of took off. Realized I loved research, realized I wanted a lab, ended up applying to the MD PhD program at Albert Einstein, continuing that research, looking at brain stimulation from a very neurophysiological and high signal to noise point of view. And then when I came back to the clinic, I was trying to figure out what to do: psychiatry, neurology, neurosurgery, neuroradiology, some of the brain specialties. I was really drawn to psychiatry. I really loved working with the patients. I found them fascinating, trying to figure out where in the brain these symptoms are coming from, wanting to help them, wanting to do research and try to figure out better treatments for them. And this field of brain stimulation in psychiatry was kind of intersecting and coming into space. Psychopharmacology had been sort of the norm for a long time, and using brain stimulation to manipulate circuits and induce neuroplasticity and help these patients with debilitating psychiatric disorders was really just starting. And I felt like I could apply a lot of my basic science research to make this field more personalized and figure out what are we actually doing in the brain when we're stimulating. So I was just fully drawn to this space. Came out to Stanford to do a postdoc and residency. A lot of my research ended up spinning off to Alto Neuroscience, which we can dive into. And then I came back to start my lab about 5 years ago. And the lab uses invasive and non-invasive brain recordings and stimulation to try to tease apart. How do we induce neuroplasticity? How do we treat these disorders better? And I'll stop there. No, I do right now I do 2 days a week in the clinic over at the VA, working with patients with PTSD and depression, doing TMS and esketamine treatment. And then the rest of my time is focused on the lab, training sort of the next generation of scientists and asking pretty basic science questions.
It's fascinating, isn't it? The neurostimulation or brain stimulation space. Is it something that within the neurotech community, I feel, is discussed quite regularly and openly, and is quite a normal conversation? And we're seeing, different types of devices now, with TDCS about to become more readily available for population. And people probably don't realize how long TMS has been around for. And now I feel like recently a lot of innovation happening in a space of different types of treatments around TMS for patients. It probably wasn't as diverse and varied initially. But what was your first sort of interaction with the brain stimulation space? Because I think outside of neurotech, it's viewed as quite sci-fi and probably we don't quite understand it, or maybe even viewed as dangerous. At what point were you like, oh, this is actually like a very valid scientific study?
Yeah, it's a great question. So again, I came from the basic invasive neuroscience space in patients with epilepsy. We're doing brain stimulation, single pulses of stimulation to measure brain connectivity, and also pattern brain stimulation to try to figure out where language and motor cortex is in the brain so as not to cut that part out of the brain when you're actually doing epilepsy surgery is pretty normal. And the signals that we saw inside the brain are very clear. It's very different than stimulating outside the brain with something like TMS or TDCS, or measuring outside the brain with something like EEG or fMRI. So I came from the sort of, this is pretty ground truth, and I could believe it. And still lots of research to be done, but I got very excited about that. And now seeing the array of the translational arc that exists all the way up to wellness tools, right? And the lack of specificity, the lack of clear brain recordings that we see as we get outside the brain. It's really fascinating. And, a lot of my research is hopefully to translate this work so as eventually we don't need to put electrodes in someone's brain and we get the signals outside the brain very strong and we get the stimulation outside the brain very specific. But it's a long road ahead of us to get there.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting one, isn't it? I think deep brain stimulation, I mean, even the RNS stuff that NeuroPace has been working on for a very, very long time as well. I mean, DBS has been around, since 60 years? Am I butchering that? Maybe? I don't know, but either way, tons of research in that space. But yeah, the constant shift, I think, in neurotech really tends to be of like, implantable exists in its initial format because that is what the patients with the biggest need, the most urgent need, probably need, and that's how we're going to solve problems here. But then it sort of drifts into like, what about a greater patient population and greater accessibility too? And we don't have to get into the trials and tribulations of market access and patient populations eligible for these things, because I think that's a difficult conversation to have with things like DBS, for instance. But I think that's what's so exciting about the treatment-resistant depression wearable market that we're seeing more of, that you touched on a little bit. TMS, very, very fascinating market. Loads happening, loads of portable, smaller, more patient-centric solutions being evolved there, but also the TDCS space too. I mean, what are your thoughts on that as you've seen that you've been involved in the industry from implantable to where we are now? There's questions about their penetration, brain reading, and so forth, and how great the impact is. What's your 100-meter view looking down on the wearable market from a medical device perspective? We don't have to get into the wearable EEG market, which is available on Amazon.
Right. It's fascinating. I mean, and one side of it, I'm really excited, right? We want these brain stimulation tools to get to the masses, to be portable enough that we can ship to someone's house, to get to the point where even on wellness, we can increase your attention and focus and sleep, right? On the other end, the side of things, it can definitely be abused and used the wrong way and not ready for mainstream. And yet often, investors and there are incentives in the neurotech space that might push products out too early in some spaces. So, and yet being too conservative is not always the best play either. So it's really tricky, and it depends on the brain disorder that we're tackling. It depends on the risk benefit ratio that participants and patients are willing to take with this, and it depends on the signals that we're trying to measure out of this. My goal is to take some of these ground truth recordings and stimulation insights that I've had and we've had in the field and try to at least bring some of that to the non-invasive wearable space so that it's at least informed, the research is done in the right way. And then I'm really excited about what we can do, with focused ultrasound and other types of ways in which we can penetrate into the brain and measure. And I really think we can treat a lot of neurological and psychiatric diseases in the future with these wearable tools if done right way.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I think there's two sides to this. There's the form factor piece of at what point does it become easier to wear these on an everyday basis as opposed to wearing it for maybe half an hour a day, and does that time period allow for great enough treatment for individuals, or is it better to have something that's maybe more discreet that is constantly working in the background? I know there's some really discreet and like BCIs, for instance, being built that aren't that invasive, sort of like above the skull, under the skin type devices, and that's really fascinating to see. But then there's also, like you said, the reading piece too. There's this brain foundational model conversation going on at the moment. Obviously with a lot of companies just focusing on the accumulation of brain data, and there are other companies who are focusing on medical devices with that brain data. I think one of my first clients ever on the recruitment side of my business was Neuronetics. And again, been around for a very, very long time, like the forefathers of the TMS, like the commercialization of the TMS industry, right? And pretty old school to some degree now, thinking about some of the modern tech. But some of the conversations I had with them at the beginning was, we have NeuroStar and we have also NeuroTracker. And NeuroTracker is just accumulating all the data they've been using for how many decades. So this was a conversation before anyone was talking about brain foundational models. And I'm not even sure they're having that conversation, but it's a really interesting world we're in now where we're starting to understand data science, I suppose, more. And it's probably more of a reflection of the advancements of software than it is of the hardware itself. What are your thoughts on that space then of the brain foundational model market? Is that something that you get involved in much with your work on the TMS side and obviously the brain reading side?
Yeah, I mean, it's all fascinating, right? And I think companies and labs tackling each corner of this neuromodulation, neurotech space is definitely essential to make really important insights and move the field forward. And so that includes, how do we get better tools to stimulate the brain and understand where we're stimulating the brain? We need to learn more about just brain signals and EEGs in general. And this is where foundational models, I think, can be so important to provide that insight. Yes, it's important. Our lab doesn't focus on it as much as we really focus on smaller sample sizes and more focused experiments. But there are lots of companies focused on brain foundational models. And it's definitely, I think it really will push the field forward. We've had EEGs for a long period of time, but how to make sense of it, how to use EEG recordings from one paradigm and make insights into a newer paradigm that hasn't been done before, whether that's behavior or cognitive task or disorder. I think that will be, what it's done for LLMs. I think I'm very excited about what we're going to do to the brain, with the brain,
Yeah.
with these foundational models.
I do think this is like blurry line between the quest for AGI and, there's lots of non-scientific money flying into neurotech at the moment who are building these brain foundational model companies, or not even just that. I think just, medical device companies that accumulate brain data. Pretty seeing a little bit in the focus ultrasound market, for instance. But again, a conversation for another day. We don't have to tread on anyone's sort of ethical toes here, but I would love to learn more about Alto and what brought you to founding them and the work you do there and the work that you guys are doing in general.
Yeah, and before I get there, I do want to say from the brain foundational models, it's a really interesting discussion on what does the signal quality need to be in EEG and other modalities in order to get insight out of these foundational models, right? Can you have really noisy signals, and if you have enough samples and enough computational power, can you yield real insights into brain activity and cognition and disease? Or do you need really high signal to noise coming in on an individual basis? Do we need gel-based EEG? Can we do wearable headbands to the masses? And does that yield interesting scientific insights? So we'll see. I think as compute power increases, might be able to make something with a really noisy signal. I usually think that you need to start with something pretty clear in terms of the signal quality, and yet I could be completely wrong. So
yeah, well, there's lots of exciting investment happening at the moment in the sort of consumer space as well. We'll get to Alto in a sec, but that's my point about form factor is that I think like the more human hours of recording, and obviously the improvement of technology, I think there's a huge element of just like the population of users becoming more comfortable wearing devices. We're already seeing it with the Aura rings, and that who would have thought people would be wearing, like so many people would be wearing Aura rings. I think the same thing will happen probably in the future, not too distant future as well, with maybe patches, for instance. We're seeing lots of developments in that space, whether it's behind the ear patches, whether it's headphones as well, obviously. And the more information, the more data, and the more people we can get comfortable using it. And it's also a communication thing as well, about explaining to the general population about what the benefit of it is, just as we did with other sort of recordable devices, let alone a medical population, for instance, which obviously has huge, pretty more impactful results. But it's certainly really, really interesting. Yeah, and I think that the hardware is only going to get better, isn't it? We've already seen what the software can do to improve the analysis of the EEG data.
Yeah, 100%. So I was in residency. I was doing research. We were doing EEG research, looking at treatment outcomes in patients that were getting TMS treatment for depression. And in order to get the sample sizes that we wanted, we really needed to scale up the amount of recordings that we had. And so we had developed a tool using TMS paired with EEG that we could actually get into the clinic and measure what was happening in the brain as someone was getting TMS treatment. We ended up scaling up to 8 or 9 private practice clinics that had pretty high volume TMS, and realized pretty quickly that there was really strong desire to get brain recordings into the psychiatric space and to help them determine, which patients should get TMS, what type of TMS protocol should be done, when should we stop TMS treatment, when should we continue it. I think that pushed, my PI, Amit Etkin at the time, and myself and a couple other people to found Alto. So initially it was really an EEG biomarker company for devices for TMS. We pretty quickly pivoted into the medication space, and just, from a market point of view, there's just a lot more patients that receive medications and need help selecting which medications are best for them. And so pivoted into the generic medication space, and then pretty quickly decided to make our own drugs. That's actually really where I pivoted out of Alto. I was on a leave of absence for a year from my Stanford faculty job, and started a lab after that. And so I don't have any ongoing work with them right now. I follow them closely, but that's sort of the Alto journey. So I spent a year with them as chief medical officer, trying to figure all this out, wearing a bunch of hats, and then really we went from 4 to 20 people during that year. And it's very exciting, and learned an enormous amount about clinical trials, about business in general, about management, mentorship, FDA, insurance. It's opened my eyes up to the enormous amount of work that's needed to be done outside of the lab if you really want to take one of these ideas to market. And I definitely take that back to my lab now, and really, really helpful information for sure.
Yeah, I mean, it's one thing building a sort of technology platform or a software system or whatever it is. Another thing building like a medical platform, and obviously trying to get it in front of the right people. I mean, there's some amazing work being done in the market in general, really, around understanding the best type of treatment for psychiatric disorders. Or, I interviewed Owen Muir recently, who's doing a lot of work in that, and it's talking me through all the different types of TMS treatments there. I mean, are you still heavily involved in the TMS space there as well? And I would love to know your thoughts on the advancements of that market over the last, it feels like, couple of years. Really. We've seen the Saint protocol and AMPA and eNeuro using it for migraine. And obviously, I feel like every week there's something new coming out of Brainsway at the moment. We mentioned Neuronetics before, and they're buying clinics now as their commercial expansion plan, as opposed to selling physical devices. It's a really, really fascinating market.
It definitely is. So TMS and brain stimulation has sort of always been my passion from my PhD. Like that precision neuroscience idea to target a specific circuit, induce neuroplasticity, and be able to measure it. It's hard to do with medications, right? And although the market potential is much larger, I said that before. I don't know if that's true now, but TMS has always been of interest of mine. So that's what my lab focuses on. And it's more of a mechanistic question. It's how do we measure the brain changes that we induce with TMS? I don't think we're doing a great job at that. And we still don't know too much about what our TMS treatments are doing in the brain. And I think if we can get to the point where we can understand it at the neurophysiological level, measure it after each dose, I think we will be able to personalize the treatment in a way that we haven't been able to date. Right now, it's an open label treatment, meaning we apply the same treatment every single time, basically to every single person. And it is effective. When it's effective, it's very effective, but it's not effective for a lot of people. And it's not durable for even those people that where it was very effective. So I think there's a lot more we can do to personalize, to induce these longer lasting brain changes at more basic science research and application of that basic science research to novel protocols around the TMS space is really necessary. I know that's a
So
little bit, but like where we should hit in the brain, how we should hit it, the timing of each pulse in a 3-minute treatment, how many 3-minute treatments should we apply, the spacing between each of these treatments, the brain state in which someone should be in. Should they be watching Netflix or sleeping or looking at sad faces? Or all of these things are open-ended questions that haven't been answered that I think we're really probably utilizing 20% of what TMS can do to the brain. And yet it works, and it works well for a large number of people. A lot of the research that has been done, a lot of the advances that have been made in the field have been increasing access to care. So taking a 6-week treatment, condensing into taking a 1-week treatment, condensing into a single day. And I think definitely research innovations in that space. Can we add neuroplastogens to boost the plasticity of the brain? Can we add in fMRI to target better? But I think there's a lot more to be done there.
Yeah, it sounds like there's a lot of technology that already exists, and maybe medication that already exists too. And it's just about understanding the collaborations and the ways that we can use them together, I suppose. But what are the roadblocks to understanding the detailed effects of TMS on the brain, like immediately after treatment, for instance? What sort of like imaging or reading tools are you looking at?
Yeah, it's really not easy. And the current tools aren't sufficient. So, usually when I think about non-invasive neuroscience, it's MRI, there's EEG, right? Those are sort of two tools. I think to understand neuroplasticity, you really need to look at the temporal dynamics down to the millisecond level. And that's EEG. I think fMRI is getting better, but it's not there. fMRI is also very expensive. EEG we can bring into our lab and we can measure it throughout the treatment. So there's definitely value there. A lot of the issues that exist right now is TMS is really loud. It's got a loud auditory click associated with it. It's relatively painful. It's very salient in terms of the stimuli, each pulse. And each of those induce changes in the brain that aren't necessarily the brain changes that you're looking for. You really want to see when that magnetic pulse gets into the brain and activates the brain and induces neuroplasticity. How does that change the brain? So there's all of these off-target effects, as we call it, that we need to remove or reduce in order to really see the signal. The second piece is just in non-invasive neuroscience, it's hard to estimate where in the brain something is happening when you see a signal outside the brain measured, right? So this idea of source estimation, it's not straightforward. We have been recently coupling TMS with intracranial brain recordings. So these are back from my grad school, patients with epilepsy that have electrodes that get placed into their brain. So you don't have a lot of the issues that non-invasive neuroscience does. And there we can actually apply TMS and measure in the amygdala at the single neuron level about what does a single pulse of TMS do to the brain? How does a pattern of TMS change the brain? What does that even look like in humans? What is neuroplasticity? How do you quantify it in humans? So that's a lot of the work that the lab focuses on. And we're making some inroads there and we're pretty excited about it. And then with simultaneous scalp EEG recordings. How do we translate that outside the brain in a space that can actually be applied to the clinic? So in the end, the hope is in the clinic, you can actually get these EEG recordings that have groundings in basic neuroscience, because there was a time where we did simultaneous recordings and saw those changes both within the brain and outside the brain. So
It's really interesting. Well, it's obviously like different types of TMS treatments too. I think the traditional program is sort of like multi-day, multi-week, isn't it, as well? And some of the more modern associations too are more maybe 1 day treatments every 3 months or so. Am I butchering that? But it's probably a little bit easier to record 1 day every 3 months as opposed to every single day. And I think some of the criticism TMS has got in the past was asking people with depression to attend a session every day, and it's quite tricky. I mean, what are your thoughts on those more condensed, shorter programs for patients in that space? It must be some very, very interesting data as well when you're reading that.
yeah, I mean, that the access to care changes an enormous amount when you go from a 6-week treatment where patients have to live within a 30-minute radius, right? And
Right.
tune in every single day to a 1-day treatment, right? It becomes a surgery. It becomes something that someone can fly in for the day and fly out the next day. From a research perspective, I'm really excited because I've always been torn between this basic neuroscience approach of let's understand neurophysiology, let's measure each dose of treatment. But the treatments are 6 weeks long. And if I brought a patient in and treated them in the lab, we'd have to do these experiments every day for 6 weeks. And it's hard we want to capture the whole treatment course, and yet we can't it's so resource heavy that we couldn't do any other studies. Now with a single day, we're really excited because we can do an entire treatment course and capture that entire treatment course with a single day recording. So we can record the EEG throughout the entire treatment course and get these patients better and be able to capture the neurophysiology associated with it. A big question is, how do these brain changes eventually trigger a clinical effect, right? And why? And what is that? Is that a step function? Is that something that is asymptotic over time, depending on the number of doses you get? But with a single day treatment, it really changes the equation from a research point of view, where we can really capture the entire treatment course and just burden the lab for a single day, right? And then the next day could be another patient. And the number of patients we could do in a couple of weeks, becomes pretty enormous and track their clinical effect over time. So pretty exciting.
Yeah. It's amazing. I mean, what was I don't really know too much about the history of TMS. What's the reasoning behind the extended program versus the shorter programs that are now maybe more of a modern approach? I mean, what was the reasoning behind not being a thing at the beginning of the initial TMS launch?
You'll have to ask Alvaro and Mark. My initial thought is just the safety question is that, let's do this once a day. We know it has a risk of seizures. The risk is very low, but we're applying it to a new patient population, to a new brain region. The first study, let's make sure. I don't know if there was anything else associated with it. And now over time, we've realized we can apply many, many doses in a very short amount of time and not induce seizures. There is a metaplasticity question to it. And so this idea that can you accumulate these effects over time? And it might be the accumulation of these neural changes that triggers the clinical response. And so people space each dose by between 30 and 50 minutes now. It's thought to be the ideal time for spaced learning and things that we know about the motor system. This is Nolan Williams and other people's work. And then Jonathan Downers. So now the question is, can we get a larger brain change by packing in these treatments in a single day, even compared to the once-a-day treatment? So it increases access to care and potentially increases the amount of neuroplasticity that we induce by not letting that brain rest for too long, right? If you work out once a week versus working out once a day, right? There's an ideal space there to let your brain recover, but also not too far that, you want to be able to have those synapses strengthen and you do it too quickly, you do 5-minute spacing, you do the entire treatment course within an hour, you won't get the optimal effect either.
Yeah.
So finding that spacing, again, this is where we need brain recordings and need to understand the neurophysiology better. We know this from slice physiology, from animal experiments. We know some of this from the motor cortex, but it's a different brain region. It's a different circuit. And so we need to test all of these.
Yeah. I mean, there's similar conversations happening in the usage of sort of psychedelics too, in relation to neuroplasticity as well, around that, a lot of the work on psilocybin happening at the moment as well, and ketamine treatment too.
Yeah.
It's just about the spacing between each treatment too. I've heard that from a lot of people actually at the moment who are involved in those sort of
Spacing, the
studies.
brain state, the combination of treatments, I get
Yeah.
so many patients asking me, can I get the S-ketamine plus the TMS? Can you do one before the other? And yeah, we'd love to. We need to do a lot more research to see what's
Yeah.
effective, and some might reverse the effect, right? So there's so many new treatments coming into this space that are just really exciting, but there's still a lot of research that needs to be done. And that's why I'm sitting here in the lab, and I'm not,
Yeah.
not in the company. I love it. I love being the skeptical neuroscientist and testing out these questions.
I mean, it's fascinating, isn't it? There's so much advancement in the space, so much money flowing into neurotechnology companies right now, but obviously it all stems down to the research being done in labs, and also being able to have, like you said, great access for patient populations. And once things do reach the market, I mean, you're involved in quite a few different companies from an advisory perspective. I'm sure there's something you can and can't talk about in that space. I mean, I know that Selma Health, I saw on your LinkedIn, a very, very interesting company. They're actively involved in TMS, I believe, but I could be wrong. But I mean, I'd love to know about some of these companies you're involved in, and some of the work you're doing there, and what those sort of collaborations look like. Because advisory positions can mean 100 different things.
Yeah, 100 different things. I'm still trying to figure it out. And every company needs something different, right? Some are in
Yeah.
clinical trial, phase 2 clinical trials, and just want a clinician to stare at the results they have. And other ones are figuring out the study design. Some other ones are developing TMS hardware and trying to figure out what the best coil design is. So, wear a lot of different hats in that advisory space, and some are very frequent touch points, and some are very infrequent. And so, it's been fun exploring for sure. And that's the space that I'm in. Usually it is around, second opinions on the science for the clinical trials, patient populations that they're interested in, but it's a very different question in each company. So it's, I keep it vague. But it's fun. It's not the type of role that I have on my day to day in the lab, and it's fun that they value, um, my insight, and I get to see what these companies are doing and trying to bring these treatments to market. I usually see them earlier than they actually, get through the FDA, of course, and doesn't take up too much of my time, which is nice. And it's fun. It's a
Yeah.
different role.
That makes sense. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because you're involved in the two complete different sides of the world, right? The pressures, you've seen it from Alto, right? The pressures of building and growing a business and getting it to market and it being profitable. You have employees, you have to pay them, you have regulatory issues to deal with, you have investors, and all sorts of different complexities to attack every day. But then you also at the same time working in the research side with the lab. Same thing. You're trying to make breakthroughs scientifically to help these companies progress as well. And I guess they both come with different stresses. Do you have a preference for each side of it? Would you ever go back into industry? I'm not trying to headhunt you here. I'm just curious.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the fascinating things I learned from Alto and then coming back to the lab is we were doing similar things, right? We were growing a company from 0 to 20 is not all that different from growing a lab from 0 to 20, right? You need to make a website and marketing and hiring and management and strategy and culture and all of these things. It really wasn't all that different. So it's actually an amazing fellowship in how to run a lab prior to launching my lab. So that was really refreshing. I realized in this ecosystem, I love being a skeptical neuroscientist, and I love being a mentor. And while I value what is needed in the business space, in the neurotech world. I don't need to be there full time. And my heart, I think, is in the chasing the signals, being creative, being skeptical. I really have found my home in this ecosystem. Would I ever jump full time? Yeah, depending on the idea, depending on how grant funding is and where the NIH sits 10 years from now, who knows, right? But right now, I'm very happy, and I love my team. I love mentoring. I love still being that neuroscientist, and having one foot in the industry space, be doing the consulting. But I don't need to be there in the day to day. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Yeah, there's lots of interesting angles now, aren't there, really, in relation to neurotech and the esketamine space we mentioned before as well. I mentioned Owen Muir at the beginning of the chat, and there's Osmind too, doing some really cool stuff there. And there's neurotech clinics now too, which is a really unique way for, I think, neurotechnologists to interact with the community as well. And that's certainly growing. There's tons of these clinics out there. But you mentioned something to say around mentoring. It's maybe like the last thing I wanted to really ask you about is kind of inspired me to do some coaching with my community as well. And I saw a lot of your outreach with on LinkedIn with the neurotech community, whether it's PhD grads or other people just looking for guidance in the industry. I mean, what was the sort of inspiration behind that? Was it just genuinely trying to help people out? Because it's a tough market out there, right?
Yeah, it's been a really fun experience the last 6 months. To be honest, I've always wanted to share my ideas. I think I grew up in that generation that I was just scared to put out my thoughts, whether it's Facebook or, social media accounts. It was a little bit after Nolan Williams' passing, to be honest, but realizing that we only have so much time on this planet. Getting your ideas out there, if people will listen and want to hear it, is important. My first post was around just opening up my calendar. I have a lot of high school students and undergrads reaching out to me for career advice, and I would email them one-on-one and send them a Calendly link. And I said, why not throw that out on LinkedIn? And so I did that, and it seemed like people were receptive. And I still do that every day. I meet someone new around the world and give them, try to help them with their situation. It helps me too. I learn the amount of different situations and different goals that people have in this neurotech space is just fascinating. But so since then, I've kind of continued to throw some ideas out there, whether it's scientific papers that we have, things that we do in the lab, ways that I think about things, different transitions, whether it's MD or PhD or psychiatry versus neurology. I just, thought about it a lot and just never put it out there. And so it's been fun engaging with the community, with the LinkedIn community. It really was pretty special. It's,
yeah,
till something doesn't become fun, I'm going to keep doing it. It is work, right? It takes a lot of time. Posting these and engaging with them, but it's a lot of fun. So
yeah.
we'll see.
It's about different perspectives as well, isn't it? What I always find really interesting about the calls that I have, and I've had about 3 or 4 today as well. And it's just, it's great to interact with the community. It's so many incredibly talented people out there, and people who have maybe done, similar types of research, had similar types of educational backgrounds. But you realize it's the stuff that people have gone through in their lives along their way, which makes them approach problem solving slightly unique, in a unique perspective. So it's like, could have exactly the same resume, but when you sit down and talk to people, you understand there's a completely different world going on there in relation to the problems they're trying to solve. And I think, like the way I approach it, I always like to think about like teaching people how to think like a recruiter. Who are you in your resume, and how can you differentiate yourself from the market? And I always say to people, like, what do you give a damn about? Like, what do you care about? Like, what do you want to do? Because you have to enjoy it, right? I realize now, having set up my own business, like, I don't know, almost 20 months ago, that it's just, putting yourself out there on LinkedIn. It doesn't feel great at first. It takes, having to swallow your pride a little bit a few times. And then you're like, what am I actually, I'm trying to add value to a community and share information, and also at the same time bring people together. And I think there's something really unique about just engaging every day with people who need help. And if it's just career help, sometimes it's like people just want to vent about how crap the job market is. Sometimes people want to just talk about the work they've done or throw some ideas around. I think it's just really a really fascinating world to be in right now. So many incredibly talented people in our industry as well that is going through so much like exponential change, with money coming in and regulatory approvals happening all the time and clinical breakthroughs going on and exciting new corners of the market popping up all the time. I mean, I only found out about brain foundational models this year, what it was called anyway. So it's a really, really unique thing, and just thanks for all the work in the space.
It really is an amazing time to be in this space. 5 years ago, I think everyone was interested in mental health and neurotech, but there were many jobs in it, right? And so people stayed in their current job. And now the amount of calls that I have where people are in their software engineering or SpaceX job or something like that, and their passion in life is, mental health and targeting. And now there's actually jobs in the space is amazing. That being said, it's hard to find, and we need more people like you that help engage and interface with the neurotech space. But it's a really exciting time to be here. A lot to do, and not easy to find positions, but there's a lot going on. Just really
indeed, yeah. I do think 2026 feels like a bit of a breakout year with so many advancements happening in mental health and neurodegenerative and brain data as well. It's in the three topics that keep coming up, and yeah, it's really exciting. I mean, on that note, maybe as a final parting piece, I mean, what do you think the future of neurotech holds? Any exciting sort of breakthroughs on the horizon that we should be keeping an eye out for?
No, I'm just really excited that everyone's trying to tackle something different, right? You have your BCI companies that are going to make huge inroads with electrodes and recordings and solving these really difficult disorders. And then there's the translational people who are trying to do wearables, and on the other end of the spectrum that are going to collectively, I think we all work together, can get to something really, really special. So, no, I'm really excited. The amount of new treatments coming down the pipeline for psychiatry. We're in a really unique space, and
super exciting. Thank you so much for your time, Corey. It's been an absolute pleasure. I'm glad we could finally do this.
Yeah, thank you for hosting. Appreciate it.
Cheers.
This podcast is brought to you by Carter Sciences, the headhunting practice that covers not only headhunting, but also fractional talent work for startups who need help, but don't want to spend those big recruitment fees, wanting to work on a more hourly basis with companies, and also career coaching for neurotech professionals. The goal is to provide cost-effective solutions across all neurotech hiring needs.